They say the Mississippi River keeps secrets better than any confessor. But on that humid August night in 1847, what happened at the Bogard plantation outside Baton Rouge couldn't be hidden, even by the mighty waters. 23 witnesses saw Mrs. Charlotte Bogard, the wife of Louisiana State Senator Theodore Bogard, being carried from the slave quarters at 3 in the morning. Her white nightgown was stained with something dark that wasn't mud, her eyes vacant, as if her very soul had been extracted. The local sheriff's records from that night vanished mysteriously 2 days later. The parish priest refused to speak of it until his dying breath 40 years after, and every slave in those quarters that night was sold to different states within the week. What you're about to hear isn't just another Southern Gothic tale. It's the suppressed truth concerning one of Louisiana's most powerful families and the night that changed everything. Before we continue with the Bogard plantation story, if America's hidden historical mysteries fascinate you, make sure to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell. Let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow seekers of dark truths across the nation. The morning after that terrible night, the sun rose over the Louisiana sugar fields as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Baton Rouge in 1847 was a city caught between worlds. The state capital had only recently moved there from New Orleans, bringing ambitious politicians, wealthy planters, and the complex social hierarchies that defined antebellum Louisiana. The air hung thick with the scent of magnolia and burning sugar cane, while paddle-wheelers churned the Mississippi, carrying cotton, sugar, and human cargo to markets near and far. Theodore Bogard stood at the apex of this world. At 45, he owned 3,000 acres of the most fertile land in East Baton Rouge Parish, worked by 137 enslaved souls. His sugar mill produced more refined sugar than any other in the region, and his voice in the state Senate could sway votes on everything from infrastructure projects to the enforcement of the increasingly harsh slave codes governing Louisiana. But it was his wife, Charlotte, who truly captivated Baton Rouge society. 20 years his junior, she had arrived from Charleston 5 years earlier as Theodore's bride, bringing an education unusual for women of her time. She could speak French, Latin, and, surprisingly, several West African dialects she claimed to have learned from her childhood nurse. At social gatherings, she would entrance guests with her knowledge of history, philosophy, and medicine, subjects most deemed inappropriate for ladies of standing. The Bogard plantation house rose 3 stories above the river road, its white columns gleaming like bones in the Louisiana sun. The main house contained 22 rooms, each more opulent than the last, filled with furniture imported from Paris and paintings commissioned from New Orleans' finest artists. But it was the plantation's layout that would prove significant to our tale. Unlike most plantations where slave quarters were positioned at a considerable distance from the main house, Theodore had arranged his property differently. The quarters formed a horseshoe shape with 30 small cabins housing the field workers. And at the center of this horseshoe stood a larger structure, what the enslaved people called the keeping house. This keeping house served multiple purposes. It was where the sick were tended, where women gave birth, and where the plantation's domestic workers prepared special items for the main house. But there were whispers about this building, whispers that never reached the ears of white society. The enslaved spoke of it only in hushed tones, calling it the place where spirits gather in their native tongues. Among the enslaved population was a woman named Marie Claire. Though the Bogards' ledgers listed her simply as Mary, housemaid, aged 30, she had been purchased from a plantation near New Orleans 3 years prior. And unlike many others, she could read and write, dangerous skills for an enslaved person to possess. Marie Claire served as Charlotte's personal maid, accompanying her everywhere, observing everything, and saying almost nothing. The summer of 1847 had been particularly brutal. The heat seemed to press down on the plantation like a physical weight, and strange illnesses had swept through both the enslaved population and the white overseers. 7 people had died in July alone, their bodies burning with fever before suddenly growing cold as winter ground. The parish doctor, Josiah Henley, had declared it a peculiar strain of yellow fever, though he privately confided to colleagues in New Orleans that he had never seen symptoms quite like these. It was during this oppressive summer that Charlotte Beauregard's behavior began to change. She started taking long walks at dusk, always toward the quarters. She dismissed her husband's concerns, claiming she was distributing medicine to the sick, fulfilling her Christian duty. Theodore, preoccupied with an important legislative session about railroad expansion, paid little attention to his wife's new charitable interests. August 15, 1847, began like any other day at the Beauregard plantation. But by nightfall, it would become a date whispered in fear for generations. The evening started with a dinner party. Senator Beauregard had invited several prominent politicians and planters to discuss the upcoming legislative session. Among the guests were Judge William Treadwell, plantation owner Charles Dufresne, and Father Bernard Layer from St. Joseph's Cathedral. The men retired to Theodore's study after dinner, while Charlotte excused herself, claiming a headache. Marie Claire later testified in the only recorded statement that survived before she disappeared that Charlotte had indeed retired to her room but had seemed agitated, pacing back and forth while muttering words in a language Marie Claire didn't recognize. At approximately 11 o'clock, Charlotte dismissed Marie Claire for the night, something she had never done before. What happened next comes from multiple sources, though many details remain frustratingly inconsistent. The overseer, Jonas Hartley, reported seeing Charlotte walking toward the quarters at 11, dressed in her white nightgown and carrying what appeared to be a leather satchel. He claimed he called out to her, concerned for her safety, but she didn't respond, moving with what he described as an unnatural purpose, like she was being pulled by invisible strings. In the slave quarters, the night was far from quiet. Samuel, a field hand who occupied one of the cabins nearest the keeping house, later told investigators, before he was hastily sold to a plantation in Texas, that he heard singing coming from the building. Not the hymns or work songs common among the enslaved, but something older, with rhythms that seemed to make the very air vibrate. Celia, who served as the plantation's midwife, was inside the keeping house that night, tending to a young woman named Deline who had fallen ill with the strange fever. According to Celia's account, given to a traveling northern journalist years later under promise of anonymity, Charlotte appeared in the doorway at midnight exactly, her leather satchel now bulging with unseen contents. She looked like Mrs. Charlotte, but she didn't move like her, Celia recalled. Her feet barely touched the ground, and her eyes, Lord, help me, her eyes were rolled back, showing only white, but she moved like she could see everything. Charlotte supposedly spoke to the assembled enslaved people in perfect U, a West African language none of them had heard her speak before. She opened her satchel and withdrew items that Celia refused to describe, saying only that they were things that shouldn't exist in a Christian world. The ritual, for that's what witnesses insisted on calling it, despite investigators' attempts to find another explanation, lasted for 3 hours. The keeping house grew so hot that condensation ran down the walls like the building itself was sweating. The singing grew louder, incorporating call-and-response patterns that seemed to emerge from the very ground beneath their feet. At precisely 3 in the morning, everything stopped. The silence was so complete that Samuel said he could hear his own heartbeat from 30 feet away. Then came the scream, not from Charlotte, but from somewhere that seemed to be inside the walls themselves. The door to the keeping house burst open, and Charlotte stumbled out, her nightgown no longer white but stained with patterns that looked deliberate, almost like writing in an unknown script. She collapsed in the dirt, her body convulsing. That's when Judge Treadwell, roused by the commotion, arrived with Theodore and several other men from the dinner party. What they saw defied their understanding of the world they thought they controlled. The immediate aftermath of that night was a masterclass in Southern society's ability to bury inconvenient truths beneath layers of propriety and selective amnesia. Charlotte was carried back to the main house, where Dr. Henley was summoned. His medical notes, discovered decades later in his grandson's attic, paint a disturbing picture. Charlotte's temperature fluctuated wildly, one moment burning with fever, the next cold as a corpse. Strange marks appeared on her skin, not wounds exactly, but patterns that seemed to emerge from within, forming symbols that hurt to look at directly. Most disturbing of all, she spoke continuously for 3 days, but not in English or French or any language the doctor recognized. Theodore Bogard acted swiftly to contain the scandal. Every enslaved person in the keeping house that night was sold within the week, scattered to plantations across Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. The keeping house itself was burned to the ground, officially blamed on a cooking fire accident. The overseer, Jonas Hartley, was dismissed with a generous severance and a stern warning never to speak of what he had seen. But secrets have a way of spreading like water through soil. Within Baton Rouge's enslaved community, whispered stories began to circulate. They spoke of Charlotte not as a victim, but as someone who had been seeking something specific in those quarters. Some claimed she had been visiting secretly for months, learning from an old woman named Mama Shara, brought from Haiti years before and said to know things that predated Christianity itself. Mama Shara had died just 2 weeks before that fateful night, not from the fever that had claimed so many others. She had simply announced one morning that her time had come, had lain down in her cabin, and stopped breathing at sunset. Charlotte had been present at her death, the only white person Mama Shara had permitted near her in her final hours. Father Layer, called to provide last rites for Charlotte, though she recovered, making them unnecessary, left only one written account of that night. In a letter to the Archbishop in New Orleans, discovered in Vatican archives a century later, he wrote, "What I witnessed defies theological explanation." Mrs. Bogard spoke of things that no Christian woman should know, the true names of angels that appear in no scripture, rituals practiced before the flood. And most disturbing of all, she described with perfect accuracy the contents of sealed church documents that have never left Rome. When I pressed her on how she knew these things, she laughed and said, "The old gods never left, Father. They just learned to wear new faces." The Catholic Church's response was swift. Father Layer was transferred to a remote parish in northern Louisiana, where he spent his remaining years in relative isolation, refusing to discuss the events at the Bogard plantation even on his deathbed. Meanwhile, Charlotte's recovery was nothing short of miraculous, or perhaps suspicious. Within 2 weeks, she appeared completely normal, with no memory of that night. She resumed her social duties, hosted tea parties, and attended church services as if nothing had happened. But those who knew her best noticed subtle changes. She no longer walked in the gardens at dusk. She refused to go near the area where the keeping house had stood. And sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, she would trace strange patterns in the air with her fingers, her lips moving in silent recitation. Theodore, for his part, threw himself into his political career with renewed vigor. He became one of the loudest voices supporting stricter slave codes, particularly those forbidding any gathering of enslaved people for religious or cultural purposes not supervised by whites. His colleagues assumed this was typical planter paranoia, but those who had been at the plantation that night knew better. 3 months after the incident, in November 1847, a stranger arrived in Baton Rouge. He introduced himself as Professor Augustus Briner from Harvard College, claiming to be researching Southern agricultural practices, but his interests seemed to lie elsewhere entirely. Briner was a peculiar man, tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. He took rooms at the St. Charles Hotel and began making inquiries about the Bogard plantation. His questions were careful, oblique, but focused on specific details, the layout of the former slave quarters, the backgrounds of enslaved people who had been sold, and most particularly, any information about Charlotte Bogard's life before her marriage. What Briner discovered would have destroyed the Bogard family's reputation had it become public knowledge. Charlotte's maiden name had been Charlotte Drayton, from one of Charleston's oldest families, but the Draytons harbored a secret going back generations. In 1693, an ancestor, Elizabeth Drayton, had been accused of witchcraft but escaped prosecution when several witnesses mysteriously recanted their testimonies. The family maintained their social position, but whispers followed them through the centuries. More significantly, Briner found evidence that Charlotte had spent 2 years in Paris before her marriage, ostensibly to complete her education. But the finishing school she claimed to have attended had no record of her enrollment. Instead, Breener traced her to a boarding house in the Latin Quarter, where she had associated with scholars studying ancient texts and practicing what they called natural philosophy, a euphemism for interests bordering on the occult. Among Charlotte's associates in Paris was a Haitian scholar named Jean-Baptiste Dessalines, no relation to the revolutionary leader, who had fled to France after the Haitian Revolution. Dessalines was known for his extensive collection of pre-Columbian artifacts and texts describing religious practices predating European colonization. He had disappeared in 1844, shortly before Charlotte returned to America, and his entire collection had vanished with him. Breener's investigation led him to interview James Colton, a former overseer at a Drayton plantation present the night of the incident. Colton, deep in his cups at a Port Allen tavern, revealed something other witnesses had failed to mention or been too frightened to say. There was something in that keeping house, Colton slurred, his hands shaking. Not just the people, but something else. Mrs. Charlotte, she brought it with her in that satchel. And when she opened it, God help me, I saw things moving that shouldn't have been able to move, like pieces of the night itself had come alive. Colton was found dead 2 days later, officially from alcohol poisoning, though the expression frozen on his face suggested he had died in absolute terror. Breener's most significant discovery came from an unexpected source. Marie Claire, Charlotte's former maid, supposedly sold to a Georgia plantation, had actually never left Louisiana. She had been hidden by a network of free people of color in New Orleans. When Breener finally located her, she was willing to talk, for a price. According to Marie Claire, Charlotte had been preparing for that night for months. She had been collecting items, soil from specific locations around the plantation, water drawn from the Mississippi at exact times, and most disturbing of all, personal effects from each enslaved person who would be present in the keeping house. She knew their true names, Marie Claire explained. Not the names in the ledgers, but the names their mothers gave them, the names they never spoke aloud. She knew things about them they had never told anyone. She said she needed to complete the circle that was broken. When Breener asked what circle she meant, Marie Claire's expression grew haunted. The circle between the old world and the new, between the living and the other things. She said the land was sick because the connections had been severed, and only by restoring them could the fever be stopped. Indeed, the strange fever that had plagued the region ceased completely after that night in August. Not a single new case was reported, and those who had been ill recovered with surprising speed. It was as if whatever had caused the sickness had been satisfied or expelled. As November turned to December, the situation at the Beauregard plantation grew increasingly unstable, though the outside world remained largely unaware. Theodore began experiencing nightmares that left him screaming in his sleep. But these were not ordinary nightmares. According to his valet, Marcus, who had served the family for 15 years, Theodore would speak during these episodes in voices that were not his own. Sometimes it was an old woman speaking Creole, sometimes a child reciting numbers in Latin, and once, horrifyingly, what sounded like multiple voices speaking simultaneously through his throat. Master Theodore, he'd wake up with scratches on his arms, Marcus later told investigators. Deep ones, like from fingernails, but his own nails were trimmed short. And the scratches, they formed patterns. Letters maybe, but in no alphabet I've ever seen. Charlotte would comfort him, but her method was unusual. She would whisper continuously in his ear in an unrecognized language, and Theodore would fall into a deep, death-like sleep lasting exactly 12 hours. During these periods, his body temperature would drop so low that frost formed on the bedroom windows, even though December in Louisiana rarely saw such cold. The slaves brought in to replace those sold began reporting strange occurrences. Tools would move on their own in the fields. Soil in certain areas would be warm to the touch even on cool December mornings. Most unsettling, they claimed to hear singing at night from where the keeping house had stood, the same call-and-response patterns heard that August night. But new elements were present. Enslaved workers reported seeing Charlotte where she couldn't possibly be. Joshua, a field hand from Virginia, swore he saw her standing in the middle of the cotton field at noon, completely still, facing the sun with arms outstretched. When he blinked, she was gone. 20 minutes later, the house staff confirmed she had been in the parlor all morning, hosting a quilting circle. These doubled sightings grew increasingly frequent. Charlotte would be seen simultaneously in her bedroom and walking through the quarters. She would be at dinner with Theodore while also observed in the cemetery, kneeling at Mama Shara's grave. Each time, witnesses were certain, and each time, irrefutable proof placed Charlotte elsewhere. Professor Breener, spending evenings in the archives of St. Joseph's Cathedral, made a discovery connecting these events to something larger. He found references in church records to similar occurrences dating back to Baton Rouge's founding. Every generation, it seemed, a woman served as what old texts called a bridge between worlds. These women always appeared during times of great spiritual imbalance, and their actions, voluntary or involuntary, seemed to restore equilibrium. But the cost was always the same: madness, disappearance, or death within 7 years of their first manifestation. Breener traced the pattern back. In 1791, there was Marie Thibaudot, a French Creole woman who mysteriously knew the locations of mass graves from a completely covered-up slave rebellion. She led authorities to 17 burial sites before disappearing into the bayou, leaving only her clothes arranged in a perfect circle. In 1815, there was Elizabeth Fortier, an American settler's wife, who suddenly began speaking indigenous languages she had never learned, revealing locations of sacred artifacts hidden during colonization. She died exactly 7 years later on the same calendar date as her first episode, her body found covered in symbols that appeared burned into her skin from the inside. The pattern was clear. Every 30 to 35 years, a woman emerged as a conduit for something demanding acknowledgement, requiring a human vessel to complete unfinished spiritual business. Charlotte Bogard was the latest. On December 10, Charlotte's pregnancy began showing physical signs defying medical explanation. Dr. Henley, examining her weekly at Theodore's insistence, documented abnormalities he would later try to destroy, though copies survived in his assistant's private papers. The swelling of her abdomen was inconsistent, sometimes appearing 5 months along, other times barely showing. More disturbing were the movements during examination. They didn't feel like a child's kicks. Instead, he described them as deliberate, almost intelligent movements, as if something inside was exploring its confines, testing the boundaries of its prison. During one examination, Dr. Henley placed his stethoscope on Charlotte's belly. What he heard sent him stumbling backward. Instead of a single heartbeat, he heard dozens, slightly out of sync, creating a rhythm that seemed to pull at something deep in his chest. Later, he could only say it sounded like a congregation of hearts, all beating with different memories. Charlotte seemed unaware of these anomalies. She went about daily routines with an eerie normality that unsettled everyone. She would host tea parties, suddenly stop mid-sentence, stare at nothing for exactly 13 seconds, then continue as if nothing happened. She would embroider baby clothes with patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometric designs that seemed to shift when observed peripherally. Theodore, meanwhile, deteriorated rapidly. He had lost nearly 30 pounds since August, his once robust frame gaunt and hollow. He refused to eat meat, claiming it tasted of grave soil. He couldn't bear rooms with mirrors, insisting they showed things standing behind him that weren't there. Most tellingly, he began writing letters to people who didn't exist, or rather, people who had died years or decades before. These letters, discovered hidden in his study, were responses to ongoing conversations. He wrote to his grandfather, dead in 1820, discussing the terms of the agreement. He corresponded with a business partner drowned in 1843, negotiating the price of safe passage. Most disturbing, he wrote daily to someone referred to only as the keeper, begging for more time to prepare the vessel. On December 15, a stranger arrived. She introduced herself as Madame Celeste Arsenault, claiming to be a distant relative of Charlotte's from New Orleans. She was elderly, perhaps 70, with eyes seeming far older. She wore all black, including a veil obscuring most of her face, and spoke in a whisper that somehow carried clearly. The house staff was immediately suspicious, no Arsenault in Charlotte's family, and Charlotte showed no recognition. Yet Theodore insisted she stay, giving her the best guest room and ordering staff to fulfill her every request. Madame Arsenault's requests were unusual. She asked for soil from 7 different plantation locations, water collected during the new moon, and most disturbing, a vial of blood from every person on the property, enslaved and free alike. When the overseer protested, Theodore flew into a rage, threatening to have the men horsewhipped if he didn't comply. The blood collection took 3 days. Madame Arsenault supervised personally, using different needles for each person, each inscribed with symbols that seemed to writhe in lamplight. She spoke to each as she drew blood, whispering words in a language predating French, English, or any African tongue. Several reported that when she looked into their eyes, they saw glimpses of ancestors, faces recognized from family resemblances but never seen before. On December 18, Professor Briner attempted to visit the plantation to warn them. He never made it past the front gate. The moment his carriage crossed onto Bogard property, the horses reared in terror and refused to go further. When Briner attempted on foot, he was overcome with such powerful dread that he vomited and collapsed. Found hours later by passing travelers, he was delirious, speaking of the child in the shadows, growing fat on borrowed time. That night, every flame on the plantation burned with a greenish tint, candles, oil lamps, even cooking fires. The light cast shadows that moved independently, gathering in corners and doorways, watching. Marie Claire, secretly returning to gather information, witnessed something haunting. She saw Charlotte and Madame Arsenault in the family cemetery, at the grave of Charlotte's infant sister who had died 30 years before Charlotte was born. They were digging with bare hands, pulling something from the earth Marie Claire couldn't see clearly, something wrapped in what looked like placental membrane despite decades of burial. They carried it back to the house with reverence reserved for holy relics. Marie Claire followed and saw them take it to Charlotte's bedroom, where Theodore waited in religious ecstasy, tears streaming, repeating, "The circle turns. The debt is paid. The child comes home." On December 20th, Charlotte announced she was pregnant, not that she had been pregnant for months, but that she had just become pregnant. Dr. Henley found this medically impossible given the advanced pregnancy evidence. Yet Charlotte insisted with certainty that conception occurred that very morning at dawn. The seed was planted when the sun touched the earth, she told him, eyes focused beyond the physical world. 9 days it will grow, 9 nights it will gather, and on the 9th hour of the 10th day, it will crown. This meant December 29th, a date Briner's research identified as significant in multiple occult traditions, a day when the veil between worlds was thinnest in the dying year. Household staff began abandoning positions with increasing frequency, giving excuses but showing terrified expressions. Those who stayed did so from generational loyalty or having nowhere else to go. Among them was old Benedict, the stable master for 40 years. On December 22nd, he secretly sent word to Father Jean-Baptiste Duchien, an elderly New Orleans priest known for knowledge of irregular spiritual situations. Father Duchien had been involved in the church's response to the 1815 Elizabeth Fortier incident. He was one of few alive who understood the pattern playing out. Receiving Benedict's message, he immediately prepared for Baton Rouge, gathering items unused since early colonization, items in the gray area between Christian ritual and something far older. Meanwhile, Madame Arsenault began the preparation of the vessel. Charlotte spent hours daily in a specially prepared room, mirrors covered with black cloth, windows sealed with wax mixed with cemetery dirt, floor marked with intricate patterns drawn in salt, ash, and ground bone. Charlotte sat center while Madame Arsenault walked precise geometric paths, speaking continuously in that ancient whisper. Passers-by heard not just her voice, but dozens in harmony, resembling whined through an ossuary. Theodore ceased sleeping entirely. He spent nights writing furiously in a journal, pages filled with text switching between English, French, Latin, and unknown symbols. When Charlotte's maid glimpsed a page, she saw architectural plans, not for a building, but for something in more than 3 dimensions, with annotations describing load-bearing sorrows and foundational griefs. On December 23rd, animals began dying. It started with chickens. Every rooster died at dawn, bodies arranged in a perfect circle around the coop. Then pigs, all 17 collapsed simultaneously at noon, bodies contorted as if trying to bow or kneel. By evening, every horse in the stables was dead, eyes wide, mouths twisted into horrifying human smiles. Only cattle survived, standing in fields lowing continuously, a sound described as almost musical, like a hymn sung by creatures that had forgotten they were animals. That night, Charlotte disappeared. She had retired claiming fatigue. When Theodore checked an hour later, the room was empty, window open, strange symbols on walls in ash mixed with blood, symbols hurting to look at, shifting when observed. In the room center, where the bed should have been, was a hole, a perfect circle of absolute darkness pulling at light, seeming to go deeper than the house foundation, deeper than earth itself. From the darkness, Theodore heard Charlotte's voice multiplied, harmonized across ages, as a child, young woman, old crone never lived. All versions spoke, the payment comes due. The circle completes. The child rises from the foundation of sorrow. Theodore's scream brought everyone running. They found him on his knees at the hole's edge, reaching into darkness, babbling about bringing her back from the other side of time. Madame Arsenault appeared, no longer elderly. Witnesses disagreed on her appearance, impossibly ancient, heartbreakingly young, or multiple women occupying the same space. "It is time," she said, voice seeming from the walls. "The vessel has descended to gather what was scattered. She will return with the payment required." A search party organized, though half refused upon learning Charlotte was last seen near the keeping house ruins. Those who went, Theodore, Dr. Henley, Judge Treadwell, 4 overseers, armed with guns, crosses, holy water, and iron horseshoes. They found Charlotte's trail easily, bare footprints in dirt, but wrong. They showed not just current steps, but overlapping impressions of different sizes, child's feet, adolescent, adult, shuffling elderly gait. As if every age walked simultaneously. The trail led to the keeping house ruins. In the burned foundation center, Charlotte had cleared a perfect circle in ash. She sat, white nightgown spread like a shroud. But not alone. Shadows took form, specific figures the men recognized with horror, enslaved people sold away, standing in exact August positions, fever victims wavering like heat mirages, older, stranger shapes predating human presence. Charlotte spoke to shadows, they responded not in words but movements creating painful air patterns. She gestured, shadows flowed like water into configurations. She spoke a name, that shadow solidified momentarily, almost flesh, then dissolved. Theodore called out. Charlotte showed no sign of hearing, eyes completely white, rolled back. Yet she moved precisely, pulling things from the leather satchel beside her, the same from August, now containing more than possible. Vials of blood Madame Arsenault collected, poured onto ground in specific circle locations. As each emptied, that person's shadow grew solid. Soil samples scattered in patterns corresponding to constellation maps undiscovered for 50 years. Then something making brave men step back, a bundle wrapped in burial cloth, moving with life of its own. Unwrapped, it was the thing from the infant's grave, no longer dead tissue, pulsing with vitality, growing, taking almost human features. Dr. Henley stepped forward to pull Charlotte from the circle. The moment his foot crossed the ash line, he screamed and fell backward. Later he claimed in that instant he saw and felt everything, the land's entire history millennia before Europeans, layers of death and birth, ritual and sacrifice, all crying for acknowledgement. More, he saw the true nature, not a summoning or possession, but a birth. She was giving birth to an accumulation of children never born, lineages cut short by slavery, severed potential futures. The thing in her womb and bundle was concentrated possibility of lost lives. Charlotte's voice rose to crescendo, speaking languages predating human speech, words bypassing ears, resonating in listeners' bones. Shadows spun faster, creating a vortex pulling everything nearby, leaves, debris, stones. Theodore pulled a pistol, aimed at Charlotte. Before firing, her eyes focused directly on him with infinite sadness and terrible understanding. "It's already done, Theodore," she said in her normal voice, seeming from everywhere. "The payment has been made. The circle is complete. The land will have what it's owed." Charlotte's body convulsed violently. She screamed, not pain, but horrifying ecstasy. The bundle moved violently, growing rapidly, shaping child, then adolescent, cycling back to infant, unable to decide age. From her swollen belly came an impossible sound, a newborn's cry, multiplied, harmonized, as if dozens cried at once. Shadows condensed, rushing toward Charlotte and bundle like iron to magnet. They seemed to enter her through every pore while flowing into the unwrapped thing. Air screamed as reality stretched. Judge Treadwell, frozen, pulled a flask of holy water Father Layer had given months ago. Thrown toward the circle, where it landed, ground recoiled. Steam rose, showing visions, fragments of a ritual started generations ago, pieces of a working so vast no human mind could comprehend. Indigenous shamans beginning something centuries ago, protection or prison for something older. Europeans arriving, breaking the working, leaving incomplete. Enslaved Africans recognizing danger, patching with traditions. Generation after generation of women as conduits, adding puzzle pieces. What would happen if completed, not catastrophe, but transformation? The land remembering everything done upon it, memory taking physical form. Charlotte collapsed. The bundle fully formed into a child of about 3, though features shifted constantly, faces of different ethnicities, eras, as if every child never born on this land. Night fell silent except continued infant crying, though Charlotte's belly returned to normal, showing no pregnancy. The child thing stood on uncertain legs, eyes ancient, terrible, knowing, surveying men frozen at circle's edge. Speaking, its voice combined every language ever spoken on this land, from first inhabitants to present, I am the debt made flesh. I am the sorrow given form. I am what you owe and can never repay. I am here to remember and in remembering to balance the scales. Theodore fell to knees sobbing. The child thing walked to him, placed a hand simultaneously infant soft and ancient weathered on his shoulder, whispered something making him scream as if soul flayed. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. The child thing dissolved like morning mist. Shadows returned to natural forms. Charlotte lay unconscious but breathing circle center. Only evidence, every man visibly aged, new gray hair, new lines, as if years passed in minutes. Charlotte was carried back, unconscious 3 days. During that time, transformations defied explanation. Every plantation house mirror cracked spontaneously, cracks forming patterns, maps of the Underground Railroad undiscovered for a century. Every book in Theodore's library rearranged, organized not by alphabet or subject, but by emotional weight. Most disturbing, every enslaved person reported the same dream, a child walking through quarters, touching each cabin door, leaving bloody handprints visible in dream, vanishing upon waking. With handprints came knowledge. Each touched person woke knowing things they shouldn't, true names of ancestors sold generations ago, locations of family scattered across South, which overseers could be trusted, which planned violence. Most importantly, they knew something fundamental changed in plantation power balance, though couldn't say exactly what. On the 3rd day, Charlotte woke as from normal sleep, no memory of past 6 months, not August incident, pregnancy, or Christmas Eve ritual. Dr. Henley found no physical evidence she had ever been pregnant, though kept to himself that her internal anatomy showed signs of carrying and delivering a child repeatedly, as if dozens of times. Madame Arsenault vanished without trace. Her room showed no signs of occupancy. Theodore couldn't remember her appearance, only sensation of being in the presence of something vast and ancient temporarily wearing human form. Father Dutchian arrived December 30th, a day too late to prevent but perhaps understand. What he found convinced him something unprecedented happened, not possession or haunting, but a balancing of the spiritual ledger. The land itself has memory, he wrote in sealed Vatican archives. When great injustices are committed, that memory seeks expression. It will find vessels through which to speak, willing or unwilling. What occurred was not evil precisely, but rather a forced acknowledgement of debts never truly paid. Immediate aftermath dramatic. Within a week, Theodore freed every enslaved person, providing money and land, actions making him a pariah among planters, but which he insisted were necessary, though couldn't explain why. He would only say he had seen the true cost written in shadow and blood and could no longer bear to profit. Charlotte lived 5 more years in seemingly perfect mental health, except one peculiarity: she couldn't bear alone in dark. Required candles or lamps burning all night. If they went out, she woke screaming about the child in the shadows trying to return. Other changes subtler but significant. Charlotte knew things unknowable, languages never learned, extinct indigenous tongues, locations of every unmarked grave for miles, true names of people renamed by slave traders, names thought lost forever. She used knowledge quietly effectively, anonymous letters to families about lost relatives, packages at crossroads with documents proving land stolen from indigenous peoples, whispering words to enslaved people in town, words giving them power over masters undeniable yet unexplainable. Theodore descended into functional madness. Continued senator duties but proposed legislation seeming from nowhere, bills providing reparations to enslaved peoples, returning land to indigenous tribes, restructuring antebellum South power dynamics. Colleagues dismissed him as insane, but proposals, recorded in congressional record, proved eerily prescient of changes a century later. Private journals, discovered after death, showed obsession with the child, not physical, but existing between states, neither real nor metaphorical. It visited nightly, showing visions of what South could have been if different choices made, futures impossible but whose ghosts lingered in potential. The child grows stronger, he wrote. Not in body, for it has no fixed form, but in influence. It whispers to the sleeping. It shows the guilty their crimes in dreams. It plants seeds of change in minds thought closed. The child is revolution given form, justice made flesh. The future reaching back to reshape the past. Professor Breener recovered, spent remaining years trying to understand. Research led to startling conclusion: the ritual wasn't isolated, but part of something larger. Similar incidents at 17 other southern plantations between 1845 to 1850. Same patterns: white woman of unusual education, connections to enslaved with African spiritual knowledge, astronomical alignments, rituals healing land's fundamental wound. More, evidence incidents connected, forming spiritual working network spanning entire South. Each ritual a node in vast power web. When final node activated at Bogard Plantation Christmas Eve 1847, something fundamental shifted in America's spiritual landscape. The land remembers, Breener wrote in final paper rejected by journals, surviving in personal effects. The land remembers every drop of blood spilled, every life cut short, every future destroyed. Sometimes when memory weight becomes too great, the land finds a way to speak. What we witnessed was not supernatural, but natural in deepest sense, inevitable consequence of building civilization on human suffering foundation. Bogard Plantation never recovered economically. Within 6 months, sugar crops failed completely. Cane grew normally until harvest, then rotted overnight, turning black, emitting smell making workers vomit. Theodore attempted selling land, but no buyer after a single night. Those trying reported same experience, vivid dreams more real than waking, living through experiences of every person who suffered on that land. Waking knowing things about slave trade, indigenous community destruction, true cost of sugar and cotton no forgetting could erase. 1852, Charlotte gave birth to a son, normal pregnancy, birth, child. But family noticed unusual, eyes too old for face, sometimes speaking to people not there, holding conversations with shadow children. Growing, clear he inherited from that December night. Could see objects history by touching, knowing maker, owners, witnessed joys and sorrows. Speak any language after hearing once. Most remarkably, seemed to know future, not detail, but broad strokes, seeing history's patterns. Named Gabriel, he grew to become most effective but least known abolitionist figure. Working shadows, provided crucial intelligence to Underground Railroad, exposed hidden slave markets, mysteriously appeared wherever need greatest. Associates said he seemed guided by invisible hands, as if accumulated wool of all who died in bondage worked through him. Charlotte died August 15, 1859, exactly 12 years after first incident. Died peacefully, but those preparing body found something never reported, skin markings grown from within, not scars or tattoos, but pigmentation patterns, as if body became living document. Patterns, examined closely, formed words dozens of languages, telling stories of people erased from history. A nun spent 3 days copying patterns before they faded with last breath. Document, hidden in New Orleans convent archives, contains only record of thousands of otherwise forgotten lives. Theodore lived until 1862, final years in state doctors called dementia but might have been else. Claimed living multiple times simultaneously, experiencing past, present, future as single moment. Last coherent words to son Gabriel, the child in the shadows was right. Every debt is paid, though not always by those who incurred it. The land remembers everything. Make sure you remember, too. Bogard Plantation abandoned after Theodore's death. Main house burned 1863 mysteriously. Witnesses claimed fire burned cold, no heat despite consuming structure. Where house stood, nothing grew 100 years except one flower botanists couldn't identify, blood-red blossoms appearing only August 15th and December 24th yearly. Land where keeping house stood became the remembering ground. Former enslaved traveled hundreds of miles to stand there, claiming it allowed connecting with lost family, remembering names and faces slavery tried erasing. Into 20th century, people reported hearing singing from that spot certain nights, not ghostly, but powerful, defiant, voices refusing forgotten. Professor Breener's final notes, discovered after 1871 death, contained last revelation, evidence rituals at Bogard and other plantations weren't endings but beginnings. Children born, not physical beings, but between metaphor and reality, still active, growing, working to balance scales never truly balanced. They move through history like threads through fabric, he wrote, invisible but essential, holding narrative threatening to unravel. They are in dreams of guilty and memories of innocent. They are in every struggle for justice, every moment of reckoning, every no more to oppression. The ritual didn't summon something new. It gave form to something always there, waiting for right moment to make itself known. Truth lies buried beneath shame, fear, deliberate forgetfulness. Official records destroyed, witnesses scattered or silenced, physical evidence burned or buried. But truth, like land, preserves memory. 1923, Bogard property surveyed for development, workers found something stopping project permanently. Ground where main house stood, depth suggesting since original construction, metal box. Inside, Charlotte's handwritten document, dated August 14, 1847, day before first incident. Her confession written in advance of known coming. Revealed everything planned, not alone, but by network of Southern women recognizing spiritual wound by slavery would destroy everything if not addressed. Years learning, preparing, gathering knowledge and power necessary for working forcing acknowledgement. We do not do this from hatred, Charlotte wrote, but necessity. The land cries with innocent blood. Future cannot be built on unacknowledged horror foundation. What we release tonight won't be pleasant or comfortable, but true. Only through truth, however terrible, can healing begin. She described network, plantation owners' wives and daughters secretly educated by enslaved women knowing spiritual traditions husbands and fathers tried eradicating. Recognized uniquely positioned as bridges between worlds, using privilege creating openings for justice. History won't remember us kindly if at all, Charlotte wrote. dismissed as hysterical women, possession, or madness victims. But we know what we are, midwives to terrible birth, servants of justice transcending understanding. Children we bring forth aren't ours, but belong to all whose children were stolen, sold, never allowed born. Through our bodies, denied future forces into present. Letter concluded warning, not end, but beginning. Children born of shadow and sorrow grow stronger yearly. Whisper in powerful ears, show guilty crimes and dreams, slowly, inexorably bend history's arc toward justice. Land remembers, children remember, eventually, willingly or not, everyone made to remember. Today, Bogard Plantation site empty fields state-owned but never developed. Locals avoid after dark, though few remember why. Sometimes lights reported moving through field in patterns suggesting large gathering, though none found investigating. Certain nights, humidity high, Mississippi slow, allegedly hear singing, work songs, hymns, African chants, indigenous prayers, harmonizing into land's voice. Descendants of those enslaved have stories generations past. Speak of dreams ancestors visit, not ghosts, but manifest memories carrying messages, warnings. Speak of knowing unknowable, children born with unexplainable gifts, debt paid in shadow and blood somehow setting free. What really happened? Bogard Plantation 1847. Mass hysteria, elaborate fraud, or something transcending reality understanding? Evidence suggests all three and none. Certain something fundamental changed that night, rippling through history still felt. Land remembers everything, every injustice, cruelty, life cut short, future denied. Sometimes when memory weight unbearable, it finds way known. Women serving as vessels paid terrible price. But perhaps understood some prices worth paying, some truths must be told regardless cost. Child born of shadows still walks, they say, not physical, but presence collective unconscious, reminder unpaid debts don't disappear. In every justice struggle, every reckoning moment, every no more. Denied future forcing into present, demanding acknowledgement, demanding change. Bogard scandal covered up, records destroyed, witnesses silenced. But truth, like seeds dark soil buried, finds light. In light, see not just horror of what was, but possibility of what might be, world where land's memory honored, shadow children acknowledged, circle finally complete. What do you think? Charlotte victim of forces beyond control, or willing participant in something should have remained buried? Hero sacrificing everything forcing injustice reckoning, or woman meddling with powers never invoked? Leave comments, share thoughts. Bogard Plantation really happened. If this tale sent chills, made question hidden histories beneath feet, subscribe Liturgy of Fear for more suppressed truths, America's darkest corners. Hit notification bell, ensure never miss investigations into stories they didn't want known. Remember, not all mysteries meant solved. Some secrets buried for reason, but sometimes refuse stay buried. When rising, bring reckoning reshaping world. Until next time, keep lights burning bright, listen carefully to stories land trying tell.